Alrighty, so now what I think I'll finish the tutorial with is we should add the orbs in Slither.io, or Slither.io, whichever you prefer. So we'll have it to where the player can run into other small randomly sized orbs, and then when he runs into them, they will delete and add to the player's score. And it's not going to really look all that like Slither.io, but we'll get to that in other videos. So I'm going to go to player, and I'm going to add a score variable, self.score. And I'm going to set it as 0, even though really in Slither.io you start out with a certain amount of health, and if you die right away, you still give off a little bit of energy or a little bit of score. We might amend this later. And before I make any other changes, I'm going to create a orb class. And I left a file here from when I was testing this previously. So I'm going to create an orb class, which will be the little dots that you collect on the screen. Class orb. And what I'm going to do here after I import Pygame is I'm actually going to copy most of the code from the player file just because of the orb. All we want is a texture, a rectangle, and we want them to have an update and a draw function. And the player has all of this, and really, minus the user input here, this is all reusable for the orb. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it for orb. And I'm going to make a few changes. I want the little orbs, and by orbs I mean when you're playing Slither.io and the, well, I don't know how else to explain it, the dots, the colorful dots on the screen that you collect, the orbs. So we're going to spawn them in with a random radius, but not a width and a height, because when I tested this earlier, I made width and height both random, and so some orbs weren't perfectly round, they were stretched out, and so the parameters are going to be x, y, and radius, not width and height. So I'm going to put radius here, and so I'm accordingly, the rectangle still requires 4 arguments, so I'm going to put r for radius and r for radius here in place of width and height. And because by putting them both in the same value, I'm guaranteed to get a circle, a perfect circle every time. And what else do I need to change here? So when I rescale the image so that it matches the rectangle, instead of width and height, it's just going to be radius, radius. And the orb does not need a score, and it does not need a speed. Alright, update, it does not need any of this user controls, and we're going to put in the collision code for when the orb deletes once the player runs into it. We'll add that later, but for now I'm going to put pass. The drawing function is the exact same because we have a texture, rectangle.x, rectangle.y, and it requires a window. So this is the orb class here. So I'm going to rewrite main.game.py to account for this orb and get it in the game. So from orb, import orb. And what I'm going to do is inside of the constructor, I'm going to create I'll do it right here. I'm going to create a list of orbs. Self.orbs is equal to, and I'll start it as an empty list. So before I do any more coding, as it stands, the play function is what starts the entire game, as I specified in the main.py file, but I actually want to add a new function that's going to come before play, and it's going to be init or initialize, and it is not to be confused with the constructor, which has underscores. And inside of here, the point of this function is to do any kind of preparation work before the game can be played. And for me, we have a list of orbs, and right now our game is pretty small, but in the future there's going to be thousands of orbs, and I could create thousands of randomly spawned orbs in the constructor and have this constructor be really long, or I can save that job for another function, and that's what I want this function to do. It's going to be any preparation work, and I would consider creating orbs to be preparation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create 10 orbs, and they're going to be spawned at random positions and with a random size, which means obviously X, Y, and the radius are going to be random. So I'm going to create a for loop for I in range 0 to, and since I'm starting at 0, I don't need to say 0. I can just put my ending number. And I also could put 10, but magic number, and I don't want to hard code that. So I'm going to say num orbs to be the starting number of orbs, and this will be equal to 10. So now I'm going to put num orbs inside of here. And now this for loop will run 10 times. So what I'm going to do is, in order to create an orb, I need to randomly generate an X, a Y, and a radius for this orb to spawn. So I'm going to import random for that. Import random. And inside of here, I'm going to say the X, the random X. You could just say rand X. I do that a lot. And in fact, I'll do it here. Rand X is equal to random.rand int. And I want the orbs to spawn anywhere inside of the window. So I'm going to put, and for now that's not going to be, that won't be permanent, because obviously the window won't capture the whole game, so you can't possibly get every single orb. But for now, we're going to have all 10 orbs spawn inside the window in view. So rand X is equal to random.rand int. The starting will be 0, and the ending number will be the width of the screen. So I will say, I'll type in self.windims 0. Then the random Y is going to be similar. It's going to be a random number between 0 and the window height. So windims 1. And the random radius is going to be between, and I don't remember what I decided last time. I think random.rand int. Now I can't start it at 0. I don't want to spawn an orb that I can't see. So I'm going to make the minimum 10 for the radius and the maximum 50, which, if you recall, 50 is the starting width for the player. So I'm actually just going to use the starting width here. Starting width here, so that the orb can, by a small chance, be the exact same size of the player, but will otherwise be smaller. And I'm content with this. Now I just create the new orb. New orb is equal to orb x, or rand x, rand y, rand r, and then self.orbs.append new orb. And now I have created all 10 orbs that will start a game, but I need to add back the play function. So I'm going to replace this game.play with game.init. Since I want init, the preparation, the initialization before the game, I want this to happen before play does. So init will happen, and I could then say game.play, but I would rather just put that call inside of the init function itself. So I'm going to end the init function with self.play, because I just like the idea of this game starting itself on just one function here. I like that. And yes, I didn't need this init function. I could have put all this code inside the constructor, but I didn't really feel like doing that, and when this game gets more complicated, I don't think that'll be really readable. So this is what I'm doing for now. I have an init function. So we have an orb here. We've created the orbs. We have an orb, we've created the orbs. We have the orb class, and we've created the orbs here in the init function. So now I have to draw them and update them, and I'm going to focus on drawing them first, just to make sure we can get them on the screen. So inside the render function, I'm going to create a for loop that will draw each of the orbs one by one for orb in self.orbs, and inside of here I will put orb.draw. and it requires the window. And that should be enough to render the orbs to the screen, and it was. So it's kind of ugly. They're all the same color, and that's because the texture is the same texture for the player, which is red, and we'll fix that. If not this video, probably the next one. But if I bring this back up, all the orbs spawn, some of them of different sizes, as you can see, which is great. But now I want the orbs to disappear when I touch them, and right now they don't disappear when I touch them. So to do that, we actually need to change the update function, because this is where an orb deleting itself when a player touches it, that is clearly the jurisdiction of the update function, not the draw function. So inside of the orbs update function, I'm going to put I'll just put a simple if statement. This will be a pretty easy function. And here we're going to use that collision function I mentioned previously for the rectangle. I'm going to type if self.rect.collide rect. And this is the collision function. It is a function owned by the rectangle class, and it simply takes another rectangle as an argument, and it returns true if those two rectangles are touching, and it returns false if the two rectangles are not touching. And we're checking a collision with the player, so we need to put the player's rectangle inside of here, which is the player.rect. So I would put player.rect here. But we have no idea what player is, so we'll need to pass that as a parameter, player, because we'll pass in the the main game's player variable here. So now, after this, if self.rect.collideRect, if this rectangle is touching this rectangle, then what we want to do is, well, actually, let's make it simple for now. Let's just increment the player's score, since we have a score variable here. So I'll add a player.score plus equals 5. And this is a magic number, but this code is, I actually have no idea what the score should be. And since the player has no capability of changing size at the moment, I'm going to leave it as a magic number and not create a new variable for it. So what I should do, and to see this change, I'm going to, inside the player, I'm going to, every single time he updates, I'll just print out his score. Print self.score. And so now if this works correctly, then every single time a player touches an orb, it will increment his score. But I gotta call the update function. So inside of main game.update, I'm going to create, I'll do it right here. So again, right here is where the window events are processed. Here is where the player is updated. I may as well leave comments. And then here, the player is being updated. And then down here, we'll have the orb update. Orb update, and I'll add a for loop again for orb in self.orbs orb.update player, and that should be it. Oh no, and it's saying player is not defined because I forgot, as usual, self.player. And we're getting a bunch of zeros because the player has no score. Now, I'm going to guess as soon as I touch this orb and stay on it, my score is going to explode because the orb's not deleting and it's just infinitely adding to my score. So let's see. Yeah, and the score, as soon as I'm touching this orb, the score just explodes here. But that's fine. We know the collision detection is working. And that's why, again, we use this rectangle. The texture would have been enough to draw. The texture plus maybe or let me go to the player. The texture would have been enough to draw on the screen, and then I could have added my own self.x and then self.y, But if I do that, I miss out on the built-in Pygame collision function, collide rect here, which came in handy. So now what we're going to do is, instead of, well, we'll keep incrementing the score, but I also want to delete the orb once the player touches it so it doesn't explode his score to 1,800 like it did here. So to do that, we need a way of telling the main game if this orb has touched the player. I could create a touched player variable, self.touched player is equal to false, and then as soon as the player touches the orb here, then I can just say self.touch player is equal to true, and then the main game can look for that. But it would be even easier if I just return a value for update. So I'm going to return the value true. I'm going to return true if the player does in fact, oh, and I don't know why this tab is inconsistent here. I'm going to delete this. There we go, much better. So I'm going to return true if the player is or has touched the orb, and at the end here, return false. I'm going to return false if the player has not touched the orb. And no, your function will not return both of these, because if the player is touching the orb, it's going to execute this, then it's going to execute this, and as soon as you have a return statement, the function ends. So return false will never be reached. So now let me go back to the main game function. So again, we need to return values so the main game has a way of telling if the orb actually touched the player. So I'm going to go to main game, and I'm going to go back to update. But we're going to do, here it is, the orb update. But I'm going to add a little bit more logic this time. I'm going to say if orb.update is equal to true, or again, when you're checking if it's something's equal to true, you can just ignore the equals true. You can't do that with equals equals false, but you can do it with equals equals true. If orb.update self.player, so if the orb did touch the player, then what we want to do is delete this orb. So all you need to do is type self.orbs.remove orb. And now, unless I made a mistake, and I did make unindent does not match any outer indent level on line 13 from orb. Let's see what I did on line 13 on orb. Oh, it's because I'm getting this weird indentation stuff where there's an extra space here. I have no clue why that's happening. Let me pause and fix that. Okay, I didn't really need to pause for that, but I did, and here we are. If I run it, we should be all good to go. The player, I'm going to run it to the small one down here, and my score is 5, and it disappeared. I'm going to run into this, and I can run into all the other ones, and it will increment my score accordingly. Now, let me run it again. Alright, I wanted to point something out right here. Notice how this orb technically did spawn in on the screen, but half of it is hanging off. And that seems to be outside of what I wanted it to do, because I said the orb should spawn anywhere between 0 and the width of the screen for the X, and 0 and the height of the screen for the Y. But again, keep in mind, the position for Pygame is right here in this top left corner, which means, and I ought to open Paint to illustrate this, which means if this is my window viewing space here, and I have an orb that spawns right here, even though it's outside of the screen by a normal definition, its corner meets the requirements. Its corner, the top left corner here, its X is actually the screen width, which can happen by a very small chance according to our code here. The X can be the width of the screen. It just spawns anywhere from 0 to the width of the screen, which is a 1 in like 1,000th chance here. But it could happen. the orb could spawn outside the screen because the corner is still technically a part of the screen, technically inside of the screen. And I'm not going to actually fix that because the orbs spawning only inside the screen is temporary. For the future, we're going to have a camera so that when the player moves, all the orbs and everything else will move in the opposite direction that the player moves. And really, it wouldn't matter if the orb spawned off the screen. All the player would need to do is move towards it, like any reasonable video game. So from there, I believe I am done with this video. We have a very, very low quality Slitherio, and all you can do is collect the orbs. But I believe for the next video, I'm going to focus more on the camera movement, so that instead of the player moving around randomly like this, the camera's actually going to track his movement, and all the orbs will move instead. And also, I'll fix the textures for next time. But thank you for watching.